Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改
变世界.
Change organizations.
Change the world.
This is joint work with Kate Casey, who's here at the Stanford GSB, and Rachel Glenister at MIT. So it's great to present to this group. We work in this paper really focuses on the issue of institutions and the role that institutions may play in economic development is an issue that's become very prominent in the literature in recent years. There's a widespread agreement that institutions matter for development. A lot of people agree on that point. There's a lot less agreement on exactly what institutions are best for promoting development, and even less consensus on how you might get from the institutional arrangement you have to these good institutions, if we could define them. So still lots of open questions. We're interested in this set of issues in the context of foreign aid. In post-conflict settings like Sierra Leone, the country that we focus on, there's been a lot of emphasis on reforming, reshaping institutions, and foreign aid donors have been very active in these efforts. The question that really motivates this paper is this last one. Is it possible for donors to reshape institutions in post-conflict countries? How could it work? How might it fail? I'm going to leave aside the question of whether or not it's desirable for donors to do this. You might ask yourself the question about what are the limits of the kinds of influence or control donors should have, and to what extent is foreign aid donors' attempts to reshape institutions violations of sovereignty. I'm going to leave that aside, and we're going to focus on implementation. I see Kate, my co-author, just came in, so just in time. Among donors today, there are lots of attempts to reform institutions, including in post-conflict settings, and probably the most popular way of doing so in terms of money spent and effort is through what's called community-driven development, or CDD. Billions of dollars are spent every year on CDD programs in poor countries. And the goal of CDD programs is to reform institutions, especially local level institutions, hence community, to make them more accountable, more democratic, responsive, really to improve both inclusion and promote inclusion and improve competence. So we focus on an effort in Sierra Leone to do just that. We started working right after the conflict, the civil war ended in Sierra Leone. And work on what we're doing in this paper today is evaluating the impact of a program that was a Sierra Leone government program, but was funded by foreign aid donors. It was a pretty large program. We worked in hundreds of villages and thousands of households over a pretty long time frame. So one of the things that's nice about this program is the study does stretch over 4 years. And a longer time frame may be particularly important when you study institutions, because institutions don't appear overnight and they may take time to change. So that's one of the interesting elements of the study. The study was carried out as a randomized experiment. So in a lot of the analysis, I'll be comparing the villages that received the CDD intervention to a control group that didn't. And a couple of the points I'll highlight in a few minutes are some new measures we developed to try to measure, to get at institutional performance, as well as a methodological innovation of the study, which is the use of a pre-analysis plan to tie our hands when we analyze the data. And I'll explain why we thought that was a useful thing to do, and when this kind of approach might be useful for other researchers, and what the limitations are of such an approach. So just to get into a little more of the detail about CDD, this is a quote from a World Bank publication from a few years back that extols the virtues of community-driven development. And there's been a lot of advocates and policymakers who have claimed that this sort of approach of reforming local institutions is going to be critical for development. They claim that doing so will make poverty reduction efforts more responsive to demands, more inclusive, more sustainable, more cost-effective, achieving immediate and lasting results. So hopefully they didn't overpromise there, but they went for it. And a lot of advocates claim, this is the way forward. We need to completely reshape institutions, and doing so is going to unleash the energies of the poor. And by unleashing them, by bringing them in to government, we're going to get all these unbelievable outcomes. So this is what we're going to test in this study today. Why might we think that reforming institutions could be useful in Sierra Leone? Why did donors push this? Why did the government go along with this? Well, there's reasons, a number of reasons, both at the central government and local government levels. Sierra Leone is a country that, before the war, was undemocratic. So Shaka Stevens, the long-term dictator, dismantled democratic institutions, banned opposition parties, dismantled local elected councils, and really centralized rule in his own hands. And together with this political centralization came completely dysfunctional public service provision. So Sierra Leone in the 70s and 80s was at the bottom of the world in terms of educational provision, in terms of health outcomes. There was just a collapse of public services. And it was rated one of the world's most corrupt countries. The local level institutions are dominated by a traditional system of chiefs that really were consolidated when British colonial rule was established in the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And those institutions are no more democratic or accountable than the national level institutions. Local chiefs are elected by a very restricted electorate of ruling families, so chiefly families. Chiefs rule for life, and they have tremendous power. They're the local judge. They literally hold court and adjudicate disputes. They have the power to levy taxes. They have the power sometimes to even coerce labor. They can get young folks to work on their land. And the capricious nature of their rule and their sort of incredible, almost despotic powers was a factor that many scholars have pointed to as contributing to the dissatisfaction that led to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1991. Of course, there were lots of factors. In terms of gender equity, which is going to be one of the things we look at here, there's also very little representation for women at the local level in Sierra Leone. So in most parts of the country, with the exception of a few small areas, women cannot run to be chiefs. They can't be paramount chiefs, local chiefs, village headmen, none of that. So they're excluded from political power and have very little voice. In fact, when we look at some of our baseline data, or we observe village meetings and try to get a handle on how involved different groups were, different demographic groups were in deliberations and discussions, women speak up in meetings just much less than men. There's a very strong discrepancy in their visible public involvement in local political life. So in particular does the project that we study do, or did it aim to do? The project's called Go Befo. Go Befo means go forward in Creole, which is Creole's an English dialect. That's the lingua franca of Sierra Leone. The project had three components that are very typical of CDD projects elsewhere. The first was financial grants. These were financial grants meant to fund local public goods, building schools, building latrines, building drying floors where the community can dry their rice, very important in an agricultural society, fixing up roads and bridges. And this is a decent amount of money. It was $4,000 something in villages with about 50 households. So it's about $100 per household, spread out over 3 years in 3 tranches. What does this buy you in Sierra Leone? Well, per capita income is only a few $100s per year. So this is real money to do real stuff. In fact, each village had multiple projects that were meaningful. There were 2 other components. The second one was training of local village residents in village leadership, in accounting. Bank accounts were opened for these communities. Village development committees were set up and elections were held to staff the village development committee. That was meant to be the focal point for organizing around local public service provision and in some sense a counterweight to the chiefs, potentially. I'll talk about how that panned out. It didn't really pan out. A series of meetings were held over months to come up with a detailed village development plan so that once the Village Development Committee had been elected and met and had come up with a plan and had a bank account and learned accounting, they could do stuff. They could just be competent and just have more capacity to raise further money and carry out projects. The third component of the project were a series of attempts to boost the participation of socially marginalized groups. And there were 2 in particular that the project focused on: women, who had, as I said, had basically been excluded from local authority and local involvement. There were requirements that women serve as co-signatories on the bank account, that women serve on the Village Development Committee, and there were also projects set aside for women's leadership. So there were women's groups in these societies that existed, And some projects had to be led by women to give women leadership, to give them experience leading projects. There were similar requirements for youth. Certain projects had to be led by youth. And youth in Sierra Leone is a kind of undefined or poorly defined term, in part because a lot of people don't have birth certificates, don't know how old they are, but the sort of ballpark is, those 35 and under are youth. So these are the three components. What we're going to do in this study with this randomized experimental design is get a sense of what the impacts were. Did the program achieve its goals of making local governance more democratic, of boosting capacity so villages could raise more money on their own and do more projects, et cetera? These are the things we're interested in. The project took place in 2 districts. This is Sierra Leone. The capital's in the west, Freetown. One northern district, Bombali, one southern district, Banth, and the crosses are the treatment and the dots are the controls. And they're kind of scattered around. And they were chosen, these districts were chosen systematically. The northern region is dominated by a particular ethnic group that dominates one of the 2 leading parties in the country. The southern district is dominated by other ethnic groups that dominate the second major party in the country. And this was actually a very wise decision to sort of spread the benefits of the program regionally and across parties, because in the middle of program implementation, there was an election that the government lost, that the opposition won. And the fact that former opposition areas were benefiting probably helped the program survive. At least that's our speculation. So the program survived that election. Our program funds were frozen for a few months. We worried about what would happen, but we got lucky. So what was the money spent on? Once the money started flowing, what was the money spent on? It was about 50-50. About half the money went to infrastructure, things like community centers, roofs for primary schools, latrines, roads. And about half went to what you could think of as small business development, both in agriculture and outside of agriculture. So in agriculture, it was things like seeds and livestock. Outside of agriculture, it was small loans for women-led businesses. It was training and carpentry for youth. And all these things could have, obviously, local economic impacts beyond the sort of public service delivery angle. So that is one of the important elements, I think, of the study, is there was funding not just of public goods, but also of small business development. OK, so what happened? We divide our outcomes into 2 families of outcomes. It simplifies things, and I think we're going to tell a story along these lines. So outcome family A are what we call hardware outcomes. Things like public goods getting built. Things like assets people own. Tangible hardware. So we have a whole series of outcomes, and I'll talk about the data in a minute, but we have a very rich set of measures, and that's part of the reason why we had to kind of adopt some alternative methodologies here, ex ante. The bottom line on Family A is the program was well implemented. There was very severe auditing of these funds by the World Bank, very little leakage of funds. 87% of the dollars could be followed all the way from Washington, D.C. to government of Sierra Leone down to a latrine. The other 13% may not have been wasted. There just might not have been a receipt kept, or there might have been some bookkeeping issues. So we think of 13% as the upper bound on leakage. This was a well-administered program, well-funded program. The village development committees were really set up. The bank accounts were really established. So there was a very serious implementation. There was a very serious implementation team that was separate from our research team, but did a very good job. And when we go back to these villages a few years later, at the end of the program, 4 years later, and look at public goods, the schools and wells and latrines and roads, whether it's based on household reports of their quality, our enumerators' independent assessments using checklists and very specific measures of quality, we see strong improvements. So the money was actually spent on local public services. In terms of small business development and livelihoods, we also see improvements. Remember, money was going to small business development, was going to train people in skills, was going to fund women entrepreneurs. So we actually see increases in household assets. We see increases in the number of traders in the treatment villages, and we see more market activity in general. So there were clear benefits to the program, and this table sort of illustrates it. I'm only going to put up a couple tables with sort of summary measures. This focus on the blue box here. This column is the average in the control group. They didn't get the CDD intervention. This is the treatment effect, with significance levels. These are the standard errors. So in that box, what do we find? In the control group, 7.9% of these villages in the control group had a traditional midwife post, the lowest level of the health system, even below a dispensary. Just the most basic sense of the Ministry of Health having a presence in your village. That increased by 17.2 percentage points in the treatment villages. if you look at these two numbers. Well, that doesn't work. Up there. That's like a tripling. Huge increase. Having a latrine in the community. 46% of villages had one functional latrine in the control group. That's terrible, right? 54% of these villages did not have one functional latrine. But the number increases from 46% by 20.8 percentage points. So almost a 50% increase in having a latrine. And we can go down the other public goods. Clearly, there was public infrastructure that improved. And there were also various measures of trading, assets, skills that improved. So hardware worked. Family B is software. What is software? Institutions, whatever that means. It means a lot of things to different people, but we try to be very specific about it. Decision-making processes, involvement of women in community meetings, leadership of women and youth in the village, the role of chiefs. All these things tell us how local politics are working, how local governance is working. We measured them in as many ways as we could, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. We literally have hundreds of measures of institutions. We observed villages meeting. Hey, Vivek. We carried out direct observation. We collected surveys. We see no impacts. We don't see any change in the role of women in village meetings. We don't see any change in the ability of these villages to raise funds for other projects, even a tiny bit out of the purview of the project. What happened? The role of chiefs is really critical here. When you come in with an institutional reform of this kind, you're not coming into a vacuum as a foreign aid donor who's funding a program like this. There was a very strong, well-established system of chiefs. And there was a critical question early on in the program, which was, what role would chiefs be allowed to have in the program? There were different voices in Sierra Leone and on the project and among the researchers about the role they should play. Some saying, look, chiefs should be marginalized because we need a counterweight to them. We need another institution that'll stand up to them. And others, and the leadership actually of the Go Before project, said if we do that, the chiefs will crush this project. So this project was chief neutral. Chiefs wanted to get involved, they could get involved. And they got involved. So the vast majority of leaders of the village development committees were male elders. I think it was 87%. The village headman, the actual chiefly authority, was the head of the VDC in over 50% of the cases. New institutions were set up, but the old institutions took over the new institutions. And things didn't really change. There's a similar example with communal farms. The people that were doing the training on the ground for the project were really into communal farms. I'm not sure exactly why. From an economics point of view, it's not clear that communal farming works better than private property rights in farming, but they wanted to do that. So communal farms were set up in the treatment villages. They all have communal farms. But when the project ended, we went back and did a survey 5 months after the end of the project. We asked households whether they had worked on the communal farm. And in neither the treatment or control villages was anybody working on the communal farm. So structures were set up, but behavior didn't change. OK, so I want to spend 5 minutes on some methodological issues, and I think I have about 5 minutes left, and then we'll get to, to questions. 7 minutes, awesome. OK, well, in that case, no. Measuring institutions is really challenging. It's something a lot of us who have worked in the political economy realm have grappled with. They're challenging because of halo effects. Sometimes there's lots of subjective measures of institutions that experts fill out, and you really worry that they're prone to halo effects. China's growing 10% a year. Their institutions can't be that bad, right? Well, maybe. But those are the kinds of biases we're worried about. Institutions are also multifaceted. When we're talking about local government and local governance, there's women's involvement, there's issues of corruption, democracy, inclusion, lots of different dimensions. Not just, this isn't a study like an economic study on the returns to schooling where you would look at the wage as the obvious outcome measure and everybody would do the same thing. There's a wide range of outcomes you might want to look at. So we felt like there was scope for new measures that captured what we're looking for more precisely, and we developed what we called structured community activities, SCAs, to do that. These are activities that were done in an identical way in the treatment and control villages, in a very precise way by the research team that put these villages in a situation that allowed us to measure capacity to raise funds, that allowed us to measure involvement of marginalized groups, and allowed us to measure elite capture of assets. Those 3 things. There were 3 SCAs. The second thing we did, because we have literally hundreds of measures in all these dimensions, is we wrote up a pre-analysis plan before we saw the data. While the data is being collected, we wrote up this plan, and that said exactly the regressions we would run before we'd get the data. We said, these are our hypotheses. These are the measures we're going to use under each hypothesis. This is the exact statistical approach we're going to use. The fear when you have lots of measures is people could start data mining, cherry picking. I have 300 measures, and I'll show you an example. You can pick 4 or 5 that tell one story, 4 or 5 that tell another. We wanted to do this not just for intellectual honesty and because we kind of thought it was cool. This is a kind of approach that medical researchers have been using for about a decade, but that's just new to social science. There are new efforts in both economics and political science to do these pre-analysis plans. But we were a little bit afraid of pressure from donors and policymakers. We were afraid that they would want us to highlight a subset of results. So this also insulated us from political pressure. Okay, so what are these SCAs first, and then I'll talk about the pre-analysis plan. We had the standard measures. That's the first bullet there. We did household surveys, direct observations, focus groups, the kind of thing we're used to doing in micro-development. But on top of that, we developed these measures. There were 3. The first was a matching grant to measure capacity for fundraising. Villages were presented with the opportunity to buy vouchers for construction supplies for the kinds of projects they were doing through the project before, the Go Before project. It was a 2-to-1 match, and we measured whether they were able to raise the money and use the vouchers at the local hardware store, which we had relationships with. So they redeemed the vouchers and told us who had used them. Did years of training, village development committee, bank accounts, village development plan, facilitation, and all that actually allow these villages to raise another couple $100 for a village project? Okay, 1. 2, we set up a communal choice between 2 assets really as an excuse to get the village together and observe how they made decisions. So we did lots of piloting to find 2 assets of similar market value where ex ante villages would have a hard choice deciding between them. So we chose a box full of individual batteries, which people like. They can use them in their radios or their flashlights. Or a box full of small bags of salt, which again are able to be distributed household by household, which everybody needs to cook. And there was a good number of communities that did one or the other. I think it was 2/3, 1/3. But we use this as an excuse to sort of step back from the meeting and record who spoke. After years of facilitation, did women speak up more in these villages? The women who had become leaders in these villages or not? Did they take a vote between the batteries and the salt? For 4 years, they'd been told how important democratic decision-making was. When they're given a choice, did they take a vote or did the chief just say, we want batteries? And then finally, an asset they were allowed to manage. And here we were interested in elite capture. We, again, months of piloting, found an asset that could either be used for a public purpose. This was a plastic tarpaulin that you could lay on the ground as a drying floor for grain. It's actually very useful to have this in soggy Sierra Leone, where you can't put grain on the ground. Or it could be used to sort of back up and support roofing on people's huts. And that's another use for these tarpaulins. So the question was, did the chief just use it to roof one of the huts in his compound, or was it used for a public purpose? What do we find? We find no impacts in the treatment villages on all these dimensions. And I'm just going to show you kind of a quick summary. Look at the blue boxes again. In the control group, 54% of the villages redeemed vouchers, and the point estimate is minus 0.01. So actually in the treatment group, it's just 0, 1 percentage point difference. Same amount of redemptions of vouchers. In terms of women speaking up, there's no difference in the treatment group. About only 1.8 women spoke up. Youth who spoke up, same thing. No significant effect either on taking a vote. No changes in the processes, the involvement of marginalized groups, or in local collective action capacity in terms of fundraising, a critical dimension of local capacity. So just a minute on the pre-analysis plan, then I'll wrap up. We were concerned about cherry picking. It's something that the medical researchers got to before us. We actually think it's a very promising approach going forward to do more of these pre-analysis plans. And so in the kind of micro social science research a lot of us are doing, what you need to do to actually come up with a pre-analysis plan is think a lot in advance. What exactly are the outcome measures going to be? What statistical tests will you use? So it takes some upfront cost, but there are benefits. There's benefits to the whole research community, because when they see results, they're going to have more confidence in them. They're not going to think they're just cherry-picked. By having a public registry of pre-analysis plans, which is something that's in the works in the American Economic Association right now, there's a committee discussing this, individuals will be able to scan the literature for failed studies that never got published. Maybe they didn't get published because they didn't confirm the priors of funders. Maybe they didn't confirm the priors of journal editors. For whatever reason, we're going to have a much better sense of studies that have been done and really what the range, the distribution of estimates looks like with one of these registries. So the way we did it is even before the program started, we came up with a hypothesis document. That's not the official pre-analysis plan, but it's very close. I think we had 10 of the 11 hypotheses we ultimately had in that document, lots of the same variables. And then over time, we refined that, and in 2009, before the data had come in, we wrote out like the exact pre-analysis plan document with all the outcomes from the final survey. Part of the reason we couldn't put everything in that hypothesis document ex ante is we hadn't developed all our measures. We hadn't developed the structured community activities, for instance. So just a minute or so, or this is it? OK, so 1 minute, and I'll just wrap up. So this is something that we did. And the kind of punchline on pre-analysis plans, or PAPs, for us is we think some flexibility is warranted, potentially to add specifications to a paper you didn't have in the pre-analysis plan, as long as there's total transparency. So we think the way going forward with social science papers might be papers where it's very delineated in a box. This is exactly what was in the pre-analysis plan, but along the way we learned something. We learned this measure failed, or we learned another measure might have been better. We learned that our data actually fits better with a different functional form, and then you can do those additional analyses as long as you're clear on the deviation. So we don't want it to be a straitjacket. That would be a shame. So just last slide, and then I love this table. I'm not going to show it to you. What we just show is you can cherry pick 7 or 8 outcomes that show institutions got much worse because of GoBefo, and then you can cherry pick 7 or 8 outcomes showing that institutions got much better in GoBefo. Because out of 300 outcomes, by chance, random statistical chance, you're going to get some great outcomes. So we actually in the paper tell a coherent story saying, if we weren't constrained by the plan, we could have kind of told you that this was like the best thing since sliced bread, or it was a total disaster. So we thought that was fun. So just to wrap up, at the end of the day, setting up new organizations through CDD, all this kind of institutional reform may not lead to institutional transformation. Institutions are deeply rooted. They may take time to change. We may not, as outsiders and foreign aid donors, may not know how to change them. We think there are actually some parallels with trends at the national level. There's been some potentially superficial institutional reform at the national level, but how deeply seated it is in Sierra Leone is still very much an open question. So we do think there are parallels to broader issues of national institutional change.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变
改变世界。
Change organization.
Change organizations.
Change the world.